Charles Kuralt had a knack for reminding America of its human side. The CBS newsman died Friday in New York, but left his road trip.
Charles Kuralt had a voice that felt like home. For nearly 3 decades, he reminded America of its humanity through stories told not from the halls of power, but from dusty back roads, quiet porches, and small-town diners. He was the man who gave dignity to overlooked lives and helped people remember that everyday kindness mattered. On television, he came across as gentle, warm, and endlessly curious. A traveler who sought out the soul of America one story at a time. Viewers trusted him more than politicians, preachers, or professors. To many, Charles Kuralt was America's conscience. But behind that image, Kuralt carried a secret. For 29 years, while his wife sat at home in New York, he was sending money, nearly $600,000, to another woman across the country. He bought her land in Montana, paid for college tuition, and signed letters to her children as Pop. He lived 2 separate lives, one as a devoted family man in public and another as a hidden partner and father figure in private. His reputation as America's most trusted storyteller stood in sharp contrast to the secret that could have ruined him. The truth remained hidden for decades. Kuralt built a career at CBS, winning Emmys and earning national admiration with his iconic On the Road series. He showed America a vision of itself that was warm and decent at a time when news was filled with violence, war, and corruption. Yet, the life he portrayed on television was only half of who he was. It wasn't until the day he died in 1997 that his double life was exposed. A letter surfaced, written in his familiar, careful hand. In it, he gave instructions about transferring property to the woman he had secretly supported for nearly 3 decades. That letter opened the door to a truth hidden in plain sight. Charles Kuralt had not just been documenting the stories of others. He had been writing one of the most complicated stories of all, his own. To understand the man fully, you have to step back to the beginning, to a childhood shaped by farms, poverty, and simple joys, where storytelling became his first tool for survival. Charles Bishop Kuralt was born on September 10, 1934, at James Walker Memorial Hospital in Wilmington, North Carolina. His mother, Ina, had traveled there only because the town had a hospital. After his birth, she and her husband Wallace carried their newborn back to their family farm in Onslow County. That farm, sprawling over 100 acres, became the setting of Charles's earliest memories. Life on the farm was harsh and simple. There was no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and no sink. Drinking water came from a pump on the porch, scooped out with a gourd that hung from a nail. Heat was drawn from wood stoves that hissed and cracked in the winter months. But for a boy like Charles, it wasn't deprivation. It was adventure. He flew homemade kites crafted from newspaper and flour paste, tied together with string borrowed from the family's tobacco bundles. He liked to joke that the kites rose so high that even God could read the headlines. He carved slingshots from dogwood branches and laughed as he teased Venus flytraps with straws, amazed by their slow, snapping jaws. His imagination was boundless, nurtured by the rhythms of rural life and the stories passed down by his grandparents. As the Kuralt family moved from place to place, Washington, North Carolina, then Steedman, then Atlanta, Charles carried with him the lessons of the farm. His father, Wallace, who worked in social services, introduced him to the idea that life was not equal for everyone. Even as a child, Charles could see the sharp divide between white and black communities in the segregated South. He noticed the police brutality reported in the Charlotte Messenger, the city's black newspaper. The injustices lingered in his mind, shaping the way he would later frame stories on television. In Charlotte, where the family finally settled in the mid-1940s, young Charles discovered his greatest passion, radio. At only 14 years old, he began announcing minor league baseball games and hosting music shows on Ways Radio. His voice, calm and rich, sounded far older than his years. That same year, he entered and won a local writing contest with a sports story about a dog interrupting a baseball game. It was the first of many victories. From the very beginning, storytelling was not just a hobby for Charles. It was his way of seeing the world. Between 1945 and 1948, Charles attended Alexander Graham Junior High, where journalism teacher Ann Batten encouraged his growing talent. He wrote a column called The Kaleidoscope for the school paper, sharpening his style and experimenting with wit. In 1948, at the age of 14, something extraordinary happened. Charles won the National Voice of Democracy contest, a brand new program at the time. Only 4 students in the country won, and Charles was among them. His prize was a $500 scholarship. But the real reward was the experience. He was flown to Washington, D.C., to deliver his speech and meet President Harry S. Truman at the White House. He also recited his words at Colonial Williamsburg, standing on the very spot where Patrick Henry once shouted, "If this be treason, make the most of it." That moment cemented his confidence. Even as a boy, he could command a room and stir patriotic pride with his words. His speech, bold and unafraid, reflected a spirit that would carry through his journalism. Summers brought him back to the tobacco fields of Onslow County, where he harvested leaves under the hot sun. He worked alongside his grandparents, helping string leaves for drying and traveling in mule-drawn wagons to markets in Kinston. On those long rides, his grandmother Rena told him stories of bandits who once robbed farmers returning from market. She spoke of riflemen posted at the front of wagons, guarding against outlaws. Charles, wide-eyed, pretended to be their protector, scanning the woods for threats that existed only in his imagination. These moments, ordinary chores, extraordinary tales, became the roots of his narrative style. They showed him that even the smallest life carried stories worth telling. By the time he entered Central High School in Charlotte, Charles was already a writer of note. He edited the school paper, crafted essays that drew attention from professional reporters, and earned the title Most Likely to Succeed from his classmates. At 14, he was a radio announcer. At 15, he had shaken hands with a president. By 16, he had earned a scholarship that would one day help send him to college. The seeds of greatness were already planted. In 1951, Charles entered the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Though he majored in history, his true education came from the newsroom and the radio booth. He worked for several stations, including WCHL and WNC, covering basketball and football games with the same conversational charm that would later define his career. He joined the St. Anthony Hall Literary Fraternity, proving his interests extended beyond journalism to literature, philosophy, and culture. His ability to juggle responsibilities amazed his classmates. He could write a script, record it for broadcast, then hurry across campus to ace a history exam, all in one day. In 1953, while still a student, Charles returned to Charlotte for part-time work at Ways Radio. His broadcasts didn't sound like those of other announcers, who rattled off statistics. Instead, he spoke as if he were sitting in the listener's living room, weaving anecdotes and small observations into the commentary. Listeners loved it. The station received phone calls praising the young announcer. Managers couldn't believe the voice belonged to a teenager. By 1954, Charles was editor of the Daily Tar Heel, UNC's student newspaper. He quickly earned a reputation as fearless. His editorials challenged segregation, angering local politicians who branded him a communist. When the university banned alcohol in fraternities, Charles mocked the policy in print with a witty editorial titled Pierre, Meet Fred, comparing the decision to a Frenchman banning wine. His words stung, provoked, and entertained. He didn't just report. He challenged power. That boldness became his trademark. In 1955, Charles graduated with a degree in history. His family hoped he would pursue law, but journalism had already chosen him. He had just won a national award for a radio documentary on North Carolina's past, a piece so professional that it caught attention across the country. To give up law school for the uncertainty of journalism was a gamble, but Charles embraced the risk. His family was not wealthy, but he was determined to follow his passion. 2 years later, in 1957, his gamble paid off. CBS hired him at just 23 years old, making him the youngest correspondent in the network's history. His childhood hero, Edward R. Murrow, worked in the same building. For a boy who once flew newspaper kites above a tobacco barn, it was a dream realized. Charles's early years at CBS were demanding. He began with radio assignments, writing short news pieces in the middle of the night. The pressure was relentless, but it sharpened his ability to tell stories quickly and clearly. In 1960, barely 25 years old, he became the first host of a primetime series called Eyewitness to History. That year, he helped cover the landmark debates between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. 77 million people tuned in, more than 60% of American adults. Variety magazine praised Charles as young, poised, and commanding, a reporter who exuded trust without theatrics. The following year, CBS sent him abroad as chief Latin American correspondent. At just 26, he was responsible for covering 23 countries during a time of riots, revolutions, and political upheaval. The work was dangerous, but Charles remained calm under pressure. His reporting during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 proved he could be trusted in the most perilous circumstances. Returning to the U.S. in 1964, Charles found himself covering a nation in turmoil. The Vietnam War escalated. The civil rights movement exploded across the South. He was in Selma during the marches and in Vietnam during bloody ambushes. In one assignment, half the company of soldiers traveling with his crew were killed. He narrowly escaped death. In 1965, he produced a Christmas special from Vietnam, capturing raw battlefield moments, including the death of a soldier in front of the camera. Viewers were stunned. Charles was barely in his 30s, but he had already documented war, revolution, and civil strife at the highest levels. Yet the toll was heavy. Competing with other reporters, chasing blood and violence drained him. By 1967, Charles was ready for a new idea, something no one at CBS expected. Charles pitched his bosses a strange proposal. No assignments, no deadlines, just 3 months on the road, seeing what I can see. Inspired by John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, he wanted to wander America in a motorhome and tell stories about ordinary people. At first, CBS laughed, but one executive reluctantly approved, so long as he kept costs low. That fall, Charles and cameraman Isidore Bleckman set out in a rented motorhome. The fridge was stocked with beer and soda, the cupboards with peanut butter and crackers. Every morning, they picked a new town about 100 miles away and drove. Out of that experiment came On the Road. The first segment, broadcast October 27, 1967, profiled a couple in Vermont making maple syrup. George Butler told Charles, "You can get color and you can get sound, but you can't get smell. The aroma is one thing. You have to be here to feel it." It was simple, authentic, and unlike anything else on television. Viewers loved it. Over the next 25 years, Charles traveled over 1 million miles, filming more than 500 stories. He found a 99-year-old bricklayer still at work, a man living in a house made of beer bottles, a woman who owned the world's largest ball of string. He celebrated jugglers, sheep shearers, tattoo artists, rodeo riders, and bagel bakers. Time magazine called his stories 2-minute ceasefires, moments of peace during an era of chaos. In 1970, producer Shad Northshield revolutionized the series by adding mobile editing equipment. Now they could edit stories on the road without returning to New York. This freedom kept the series alive and thriving. One of Charles's most famous stories aired in 1972. It featured old hobos riding the rails in California. Forgotten men, marginalized by society, were treated with dignity and care. The segment earned him an Emmy. More importantly, it preserved the memory of a disappearing way of life. By the 1970s, On the Road had become a cultural treasure. While other news programs focused on war, protests, and scandal, Charles offered viewers kindness, humor, and humanity. He showed them a country worth believing in. Yet even as Charles gave America stories of honesty and decency, he lived a contradiction of his own. For 29 years, he maintained a secret relationship with Patricia Shannon, a school teacher he had met in Montana. While his wife, Suzanne, stayed in New York, Charles quietly supported Patricia and her children. He sent them money, bought land for them in Montana, and even paid for college tuition. He signed letters as Pop, embracing a role he could never acknowledge publicly. This double life remained invisible to his viewers. On screen, he was the solitary traveler, wandering America's back roads. Off-screen, he divided his loyalties. His two worlds never collided until his death in 1997. After he passed, Patricia produced a handwritten letter from Charles instructing her to transfer land into her name. The revelation shocked those who thought they knew him best. Court battles followed, exposing the private life of a man who had built his career on trust and warmth. The contradiction didn't erase his achievements, but it complicated them. It revealed Charles not as a saint, but as a flawed, deeply human figure, just like the people he profiled on the road. When Charles Kuralt died at 62, America mourned. He left behind more than a career. He left behind a philosophy. His stories reminded people that decency existed, that kindness was newsworthy, and that even the humblest lives had value. He earned Emmy Awards, Peabodys, and national acclaim, but his greatest achievement was intangible: trust. He told America's story with gentleness and grace. The revelations about his hidden life did not erase the warmth his work provided. If anything, they underscored a truth he himself believed, that every person is complicated, capable of light and shadow. Today, On the Road is remembered not only as a landmark in broadcast journalism, but as a mirror of American life. Charles Kuralt showed that news could be about joy, that ordinary people could be heroes, and that sometimes the best way to understand a country is to listen to its quiet voices. His life was full of contradictions, but his legacy remains clear. He reminded America of its humanity, and that is why his stories endure. Charles Kuralt's impact on journalism was unlike anything the industry had seen before. In a time when television news was dominated by politics, wars, and speeches from Washington, he carved out a completely different lane. Where other reporters chased breaking headlines, Kuralt slowed down the pace and reminded America that news wasn't always about crisis. Sometimes it was about the farmer in Vermont who still tapped maple trees the way his grandfather once did. Sometimes it was about the woman who made quilts in her kitchen, or the retired couple who built birdhouses for strangers. His on-the-road segments proved that viewers weren't only hungry for politics and disaster, they also longed for connection. In fact, CBS executives were initially skeptical. How could a story about a man who carved decoys in his garage possibly compete with Vietnam coverage or a presidential speech? But the ratings quickly spoke for themselves. Kuralt's pieces drew millions of viewers, often ranking among the network's most beloved moments of the week. Journalism professors began teaching his style as a new form of human interest: storytelling. Newspapers had run similar features for decades, but Kuralt brought them to life with television's power. His soft voice, paired with striking images of everyday life, gave the stories a weight that print couldn't always carry. He was called the poet laureate of TV news, not because he wrote poems, but because he found the poetry in daily living. Young journalists took notice. Instead of dreaming only of White House assignments or foreign bureaus, many began to see honor in covering small towns and ordinary lives. Even decades later, reporters admit they pursued careers because of the way Kuralt made storytelling feel dignified. He redefined news by reminding everyone that sometimes the smallest stories left the biggest impression. At the heart of Kuralt's work was a very simple philosophy: everyone has a story worth telling. He believed that dignity could be found in any life if one looked closely enough. Unlike many journalists, he didn't chase fame or celebrity interviews. He once said he'd rather talk to a man fixing a fence in Montana than to a Hollywood star on a red carpet. That wasn't a line. It was his truth. Kuralt approached people with humility. He didn't barge in with cameras rolling. Instead, he listened first, asked questions slowly, and treated every subject as if their life was important. To him, storytelling wasn't about creating spectacle, it was about capturing honesty. He also believed in slowing down. In a country obsessed with speed and breaking news, Kuralt parked his RV, sat on porches, lingered in small-town diners, and gave people the one thing they rarely got from journalists: time. The result was a level of trust that let people open up in remarkable ways. His philosophy also shaped how he wrote. His scripts were never filled with complicated language. He avoided jargon, avoided political spin, and instead spoke in the rhythm of everyday life. He wanted Americans to hear his words and feel as though they were sitting next to him in that RV, riding along as he introduced them to someone special. That philosophy became a legacy in itself. Countless journalists cite Kuralt's belief in ordinary dignity as the reason they approach stories differently. Even decades later, his voice continues to echo. Look closer. Slow down. Everyone has a story. Kuralt's storytelling may have seemed warm and simple, but his personal life was anything but. Officially, he had a wife and 2 daughters. To the outside world, he appeared to be a family man. Yet for nearly 3 decades, he also maintained a secret second life with another woman in Montana. He built her a cabin, bought her land, and wrote letters filled with affection, promising visits and sending money regularly. This double existence only came to light after his death, when legal battles revealed the extent of his hidden relationship. To some, it was a shocking betrayal. How could the man who spoke so tenderly about America's heartland carry such a complicated secret? To others, it simply made him human, a reminder that even the most admired figures can carry flaws. His daughters have spoken about their love for him, but also about the distance that his constant traveling created. He was often on the road, literally and metaphorically, away from home. The family in Montana, meanwhile, remembered him as a kind and loving presence, though one who could never live fully in the open. This contradiction didn't erase his achievements, but it colored the way history remembers him. Kuralt's relationships remind us that the people we admire often live lives far messier than the stories they tell. Just like the America he chronicled, his own life was full of contradictions, beauty and imperfection side by side. As Kuralt aged, the long miles on the road began to catch up with him. The motorhome trips grew shorter, and the demands of constant travel took a toll on his health. Still, he never lost his curiosity. Even in quieter years, he continued writing and occasionally returning to CBS for special features. His last years were spent balancing his official family in New York and his private refuge in Montana. In his cabin, surrounded by the mountains and rivers he loved, he seemed most at peace. Friends say he fished often, read books by the fire, and enjoyed the quiet that had drawn him to small towns throughout his career. In 1997, Kuralt passed away unexpectedly on July 4th. A fitting day for a man whose life's work had been about America itself. He was only 62 years old. His death stunned audiences who had grown up hearing his gentle voice. For many, it felt like losing not just a reporter, but a trusted friend who had guided them through decades of change. Even in his final days, Kuralt had lived as he always had, between worlds, between families, between the road and the quiet places that gave him peace. His ending was as complex as the man himself. Today, Charles Kuralt's name still sparks recognition among older generations who remember watching his on-the-road stories each week. His work is preserved in books, documentaries, and reruns that continue to circulate online. For students of journalism, he remains a case study in narrative storytelling, often quoted in classrooms when professors talk about human interest. Kuralt is also remembered in pop culture. References to his RV trips, his style of narration, and even parodies of his soft-spoken delivery have appeared in films and comedy sketches. Yet beneath the lighthearted nods lies a deeper respect. Few journalists have managed to connect with audiences in the way he did, crossing generations and political divides. In a world now dominated by fast-paced digital headlines and social media noise, Kuralt's slower, reflective style feels almost radical. His legacy reminds us that journalism can still be personal and that there is still room for stories that take their time. Charles Kuralt lived a life of contrasts. Publicly, he was America's beloved storyteller, the man who took us on the road to meet ordinary people whose lives revealed extraordinary truths. Privately, he carried secrets that complicated his image and left his family divided. Yet perhaps that is fitting, for Kuralt never claimed to be perfect. He only claimed to love stories, and in telling them, he revealed something profound about America and about himself. His double life may be debated, but his professional legacy is undeniable. He gave dignity to ordinary people, slowed the pace of a hurried world, and showed that news could be gentle without being trivial. He captured the small details, the syrup boiling, the jugglers tossing pins in the air, the peanut butter in the fridge. That made life worth noticing. And so, long after his motorhome has stopped rolling down America's highways, the voice of Charles Kuralt still lingers. A voice that said, "This is who we are. This is our story. Look closer, and you will see it too." Charles Kuralt never chased fame, but fame always seemed to find him. His gentle voice, his ability to let silence speak as loudly as words, and his rare gift for finding humanity in the overlooked corners of America made him unforgettable. The television industry, usually quick to reward breaking news or sensational footage, couldn't ignore what he was doing. He collected more than a dozen Emmy Awards during his lifetime, most for On the Road. Each win was proof that audiences were starving for something different than the constant flood of war reports and political debates. In 1980, he won a Peabody Award, one of the highest honors in journalism. The judges said his stories were a quiet celebration of the American spirit. For Kuralt, it wasn't about trophies. He often joked that the Emmys were nice, but what really mattered were the letters from viewers. CBS received thousands of them, handwritten notes from farmers, teachers, small-town mayors, and children who recognized themselves in the people he profiled. Some said they had stopped watching the nightly news years ago, but they tuned in whenever Kuralt was on. Others wrote to say his stories reminded them of their grandparents, their neighborhoods, or their own forgotten dreams. Colleagues admired him too. Dan Rather once said, "He taught us all that a news story didn't have to scream to be important." Even Walter Cronkite, the man known as the most trusted voice in America, praised Kuralt for creating a new kind of trust, one built not on authority, but on warmth. Awards filled his shelves, but the true reward was knowing that in living rooms across the nation, millions of people leaned closer when he appeared on screen. If you ask people what they remember most about Charles Kuralt, many won't talk about the studios in New York or the newsrooms buzzing with deadlines. They'll talk about the motorhome. That big, clunky vehicle rolling down back roads became as iconic as the man himself. Over the years, he traveled in 6 different ones, each filled with stacks of maps, notebooks, camera equipment, and very little else. Inside, it wasn't glamorous. He and his crew often ate peanut butter sandwiches, drank lukewarm coffee, and slept in cramped bunks. But for Kuralt, the motorhome was freedom. Every morning, they'd wake up, spread a map on the small kitchen table, and circle a town about 100 miles away. There was no assignment, no schedule, no urgency. They went wherever curiosity pointed them. Sometimes it led to a maple syrup shack in Vermont, sometimes to a retired coal miner in Kentucky, sometimes to a cowboy festival in Wyoming. Kuralt once said, "The best roads are the ones that end in gravel." And it was true. The smaller the town, the bigger the story. Fans would often spot the motorhome parked outside diners or gas stations. Locals knew that if Charles Kuralt had rolled into town, someone ordinary was about to become extraordinary on national television. Children would knock on the door asking for autographs. Townsfolk sometimes invited him for dinner. In time, the motorhome became more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of a different kind of journalism, one that moved slowly, listened deeply, and refused to rush past America's heart. Decades after his first On the Road story aired, you can still see Charles Kuralt's fingerprints on modern storytelling. Today, entire podcasts are built on his philosophy that everyone has a story worth hearing. Programs like NPR's StoryCorps or This American Life owe something to his approach. The slow journalism movement, which values depth over speed, often cites Kuralt as a pioneer. He didn't just tell stories. He made space for voices that otherwise would have disappeared in the noise of history. Television networks also borrowed from him. Lifestyle channels, travel documentaries, and even YouTube vloggers unknowingly follow his footsteps every time they visit small towns and highlight the people behind the places. His gift was proving that you didn't need explosions or scandals. To keep people watching, you just needed authenticity. Young reporters often studied his work not just for technique, but for attitude. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to impress. He asked simple questions and listened, really listened, until people opened up. That humility has become rare in the media landscape, but those who carry it forward often trace it back to Kuralt. In classrooms across America, journalism professors still play his segments to show students what it means to build trust with an audience. Kuralt's storytelling wasn't just about America. It became part of America's story. When Charles Kuralt died in 1997, the tributes poured in. Newspapers called him America's favorite storyteller. Viewers cried as reruns of On the Road played in his memory. But soon, another story began to surface. One he had kept hidden for decades. A letter was discovered, written by Kuralt shortly before his death, leaving property in Montana to a woman named Patricia Shannon. Reporters uncovered that for 29 years, he had quietly supported her and her children, sending over $600,000, paying for college tuition, and even signing letters as Pop. While his wife remained at home, unaware of the full extent of his secret life, Kuralt was living in two worlds. The revelation shocked fans. How could America's most trusted gentleman have carried such a secret? Court battles followed as Shannon and Kuralt's legal family fought over the Montana land. Headlines shifted from praising his legacy to dissecting his private choices. For some, the discovery tarnished the image of the kind storyteller. For others, it simply revealed that even beloved figures are complicated, flawed, and deeply human. In a way, the scandal underscored the very lesson Kuralt had spent his life teaching, that every life has layers, every person has contradictions. His secret didn't erase his work, but it reminded the world that even storytellers live stories of their own, messy and imperfect. For all his fame, Charles Kuralt never forgot the students who reminded him of himself at age 14, when he was first scribbling stories and announcing baseball games. He returned often to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, his alma mater,